world is changing fast. New technologies are impacting how we think about products, services, and the way we live our lives. Nowhere is this trend more present than in financial services, where new business models and customer expectations are changing our conceptions about banking, finance, and the very nature of money. Welcome to Rebank, a visionary podcast about banking, fintech, and the future. The future of banking is here. Welcome to Rebank. I'm your host, Will Beeson. Thanks very much for tuning in today. We're happy to be on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud. Check us out, Rebank, Banking the Future. Subscribe, leave a review if you like the show, and definitely get in touch. We're on Twitter at Rebank Podcast, or you can connect with me, your host, directly at Will_Beeson, Beeson. We look forward to hearing from you. Hello and welcome to Rebank. We're thrilled to be joined by Alex Tapscott today. Alex is a globally recognized thought leader, advocate, speaker, and writer focused on the impact of emerging technologies on business, society, and government. He's the co-author of the critically acclaimed bestseller, Blockchain Revolution: How the Technology Behind Bitcoin is Changing Money, Business, and the World. Alex is the author of dozens of articles featured in publications such as Time, Harvard Business Review, the McKinsey Quarterly, Forbes, Fortune, Quartz, the Globe and Mail, the Toronto Star, and the Huffington Post. Alex is the founder and CEO of Northwest Passage Ventures, a consulting firm focused on early-stage, high-growth companies. Prior to his career as a best-selling author and globally recognized blockchain expert, Alex was a formidable defensive lineman at Amherst College. Alex is a passionate and vocal advocate for innovation, entrepreneurship, and civic engagement. Alex, it's good to sit down with you.
I'm delighted to be here, Will. Thanks for that awesome introduction.
So I joked about your college football career in the intro, which is, of course, how we know each other. Now, sitting here talking to you about blockchain, a technology neither of us had heard about back then.
That's right.
Crazy stuff. So let's see. I've given a brief kind of background on you. I'd love to hear more about your work. How did you end up writing a global bestseller on blockchain?
Well, when I first started my work in blockchain, I could have never expected it would have led to the book and everything else that's come about from it. It had a pretty innocent origin story. It was actually, my co-author is my dad, Don Tapscott, who's the author of 15 books about business and technology. And he and I were on a ski trip in Quebec, in Canada, talking about some of the stuff that we were up to. At the time, I was working in investment banking at Canada's largest independent investment bank, and he was running a multi-million-dollar research project at the University of Toronto, looking into new ways of global problem-solving using technology. And one of the things that he and his team were wrestling with was this question of Bitcoin. This is before the word blockchain had really entered the vernacular. In Bitcoin, they saw maybe another example of a new type of network that was trying to solve a global problem. But the problem with their team was that nobody had any practical financial services experience. So after a porterhouse steak and a bottle of red wine, he basically convinced me to join the team. And so I did, as a part-time researcher, really just as a fun project, looking into this new world of cryptocurrencies. Mm-hmm. And eventually, that research led to a report called the Bitcoin Governance Network, which tried to address this very interesting problem that Bitcoin, cryptocurrencies, and the blockchain world generally face, which is how do you steward a resource which is not owned or controlled by any one company or government and is decentralized and spread all around the world in a way that it maximizes its potential. And that became the first of many projects that we ended up launching together. We looked at blockchain's impact on financial services, its impact on the deep underlying architecture of the corporation, how it might transform government, and about a half a dozen other projects. Those projects eventually became the basis for a book proposal that we took to Penguin Random House, which was the publisher of two of Don's previous books. They loved the idea of us tackling this new and challenging topic. They also loved the idea of the father-son combo, and they offered us a pretty fair deal. So this would have been in February of 2015, and he and I got to work on researching the book. We ended up conducting 150 interviews, traveling really all over the world, meeting with companies, entrepreneurs, venture capitalists, government officials, regulators, anybody who would really be impacted by this. And the product of all that work was the book, Blockchain Revolution: How the Technology Behind Bitcoin is Changing Money and Business in the World. We launched it in May of this year in the US and Canada, in the UK a couple months later. And over the next year, it'll be released in 12 other jurisdictions. It's been converted into 10 different languages. So we're delighted with the success of the book, and think that, if anything, we're really only in the early stages of what we call the blockchain revolution.
Wow, well, that's incredibly exciting and interesting, because very rarely, I think, do obscure, abstract financial services technologies kind of generate the global interest that clearly blockchain has, if your book's sales are any indication. So just taking a quick step back and making sure that everyone's kind of on the same page with terminology and what we mean by blockchain. For instance, members of the audience who maybe don't even necessarily have a background in financial services technology. What is blockchain? How would you describe it? And then lastly, are there any kind of terminology distinctions, distributed ledgers, tech platforms versus blockchain, that are worth mentioning?
Yeah, totally. Very simply put, a blockchain is a ledger, like a giant database. But unlike the ledgers of past, which have resided inside computer systems, inside companies or governments, this is a ledger that's distributed. It means that anybody who runs it has a copy of it on their computer. And it's not running on one system, it's actually running on potentially millions of different computers all around the world. And essentially what it enables is for anyone, anywhere, to transact and do business and essentially move, store, or manage anything of value: money, stocks, bonds, titles and deeds, scientific discoveries, art, music, even elections and a vote, in a secure and private manner. And where trust is not established by an intermediary, but rather through collaboration, consensus, and clever code. And the mechanics of it are quite ingenious. So imagine on this network, transactions are happening all the time. Every so often, like the heartbeat of that network, those transactions are batched into this thing called a block. That block is then broadcast to everyone who's on the network. There are specific participants on the network who commit large computing resources to validate whether or not the transactions in that block are true. And for achieving consensus, for all agreeing on what's true and what's not, those participants, they're called miners in the case of the Bitcoin blockchain, are rewarded with new cryptocurrencies. So once those blocks have been established as truthful, they're added to a chain of blocks that includes every other block all the way back to the beginning of commerce. Now, the key development, the key insight here is that the information in the most recent block must refer to the information in the preceding block, which must refer to the information in the preceding block, all the way back to the beginning of commerce on the blockchain. Why that matters? So if you wanted to change a transaction, if you wanted to hack the blockchain, like say send the same $20 twice, or sell the same share twice, or vote twice in an election, you wouldn't have to just go back and move a number in an internal database. You'd actually have to go back and rewrite the entire history of transactions on the blockchain, going all the way back to the beginning. And you wouldn't have all day to do it. You'd have to complete that task in 10 minutes. And you wouldn't be doing it on one set of servers or one computer system. You'd actually have to hack millions of computers simultaneously. And if you didn't get it done in 10 minutes, a new block would be added, and you'd have to start the process all over again. So the computing resource that the Bitcoin blockchain marshals, for example, is estimated to be anywhere between 10 and 100 times as powerful as all of Google's server farms put together. So you've got this way for individuals and businesses to transact and do business, move money around in a way that's decentralized and peer-to-peer, where the security and the safety and the redundancy of the network is actually many orders of magnitude greater than any other system we have today, better than SWIFT, better than what any bank is running, certainly better than the NSA. The Bitcoin blockchain has never been hacked. People see hacks about companies like Bitfinex, for example, which was a recent one, or Mt. Gox, which happened a few years ago. What happened in that case is a symptom of financial services firms, which is that a company held private data behind a firewall and someone hacked it. But the underlying technology has never been hacked, which is something we can't say about JP Morgan, LinkedIn, Target, the NSA, the CIA, the State Department, or any other centralized service system. So it's a fascinating innovation. It's one that is in its early days yet, but where you're seeing it applied to all these different industries. And I include all those different types of things of value, like titles and deeds, or votes, or music, because those are actual use cases that are being applied today. So, for example, the government of Georgia, the government of Sweden, and the government of Canada are all working on moving property titles and records onto the blockchain. And there are a lot of reasons to do that. It would help to mitigate conflicts and disputes around title. It would help to reduce title insurance costs. And it would prevent fraud in real estate markets, because any attempt to change the record of who owns what would require you to hack a very complex and powerful system, and that would be unfeasible. In art and music, there are examples of use cases where artists can release songs that have in them programmable intelligence, basically. So anytime the song is listened to on the radio, or whether or not it's purchased, or it's streamed, or it's played in a film, or it's sampled in an advertisement, the value can move peer-to-peer from whomever's consuming it to the artist who has the digital rights to that song, which is an improvement over the system today, where, much like other industries, there are 9 different intermediaries where that money needs to pass through before it reaches the person who created it fairly. And then the final one on public service blockchain applications like voting. New America, which is a big think tank in the US, is now working with governments all over the world to help develop an e-voting system using blockchain. E-voting is one of those things that's kind of a no-brainer when you think about it. Wouldn't it be great if everybody could vote from the plant floor? But of course, they're worried about that problem I identified earlier, which is, how do you ensure the system's not hackable and people can't vote twice, or that they can't vote 1,000 times, for that matter? Well, if the vote was like a token that moved across this network, you could assure that it was only voted once. So, long-winded way of basically saying, something that started as an experiment in monetary policy, Bitcoin, has now become a general purpose technology that's being applied to a dozen different industries.
It's definitely worth talking a bit more about your book and the phenomenal performance it's had. We're talking about a financial technology book hitting bestseller lists, which seems crazy. Tell us a bit more about the book and why you think it's been so successful.
Well, it's a sign of the times, I think, more than anything. I think we've written a pretty good book here, and a lot of people have said so. But I also think that we're really sort of capturing the moment, hitting the zeitgeist, as you will. There are more and more people outside of the world of the technology industry and the financial services industry who are trying to understand this technology. And in the book, we make it quite clear that this technology will transform the world of banking and financial services in profound ways. But it's actually only one of 7 different transformations that we studied. We believe that blockchain technology actually represents nothing short of the second generation of the internet. For 40 years, we've had an internet of information, which has been a great tool for how we communicate and how we collaborate online, how we share information. But it hasn't had as great an impact on the underlying mechanics of commerce as most people would have thought. And it basically goes down to this one problem, which is that when you send information online, you're not sending an original, you're sending a copy. And that's good for information. This means I can send an email to 1 million people, or I can host a website that anyone can access. But if we're talking about money or stocks or bonds or titles or deeds or any kind of asset that has value and requires scarcity, then sending copies is a really bad idea. If I send you $20 in payment for something, it's really important that you've got that $20 and I don't. Because if I can send the same $20 to another person, or 1,000 other people for that matter, the money becomes worthless. And the same applies for, say, shares. If I can sell the same share of Apple over and over again, then the share is worthless, and I'm also breaking the law. Or votes in an election. If I can vote over and over and over again online, then it defeats the purpose of the process and undermines democracy. So it's great to have a printing press for information, but it's not great to have a printing press for value. And as a result, we still have to rely on intermediaries that sit in the middle of transactions and perform a whole bunch of important roles. So, intermediaries like banks, for sure, brokerages, obviously, but also governments, big technology firms, sit in the middle of transactions and do a bunch of important stuff. They verify the identity of parties. They establish trust. They perform all the business logic, like the clearing and settling of transactions, the moving of data. And they store that data in records that can be validated after the fact. So there are issues with intermediaries, won't get into in great detail. But what we have with blockchain is a transition now from an internet of information to an internet of value, where anyone, anywhere can transact and do business, move, store, and manage anything of value without necessarily knowing or trusting each other in the way they had to in the pre-blockchain era. And that is going to radically reduce friction in the system. It's going to enable greater inclusion. It will create a more fair economy, likely, and it will also spell trouble for certain intermediaries. Not all, but certain intermediaries. And as a result, that's going to impact all sorts of different industries. It's going to impact banking, but it's also going to impact technology, media, manufacturing, and every other major industry, we think.
Mm-hmm. I'm totally with you on the long-term implications, the long-term vision. I think what could be interesting to the audience could be thinking a bit about how we get from here to there, because there are a couple. If you think back to kind of the I guess the early days of blockchain, before that term was even widely used, people were excited about cryptocurrencies and Bitcoin, kind of this peer-to-peer, anti-establishment, anti-government, anti-incumbent monetary system use case. Now we've kind of gotten to a point where, 40 plus banks have joined the consortium like R3. You've got the largest banks, insurance companies, clearing houses, stock exchanges in the world looking at ways to develop systems around this technology. Are we going to get to the 20, 30, 40 years in the future view of the power of blockchain via a retail-focused, consumer-focused, peer-to-peer development, or is this going to be led by industry? And if it is led by industry, what are the risks of real change being seen?
Well, I think it's going to be both. And I think that's a good thing. You mentioned at the beginning the philosophy of cryptocurrencies, or the ideology of cryptocurrencies, and their proponents in the early days was one very much of anti-establishment. This idea that you can transact and do business online without having to use these traditional third parties like banks or governments, for that matter. And that's an interesting ethos, and it's one that's not necessarily bad, but it's not one that will enable this technology to reach the mainstream. And you pointed out that blockchain technology started out with Bitcoin. And I think it's worth maybe demystifying Bitcoin for a second. So I think when people think about Bitcoin, they think of it as a speculative asset that goes up, it goes down, and you can buy it, you can sell it, you can make money on it. That's certainly true. And that's of interest if you're a speculator or an investor. What's more interesting, though, is that it's a cryptocurrency, which is to say a currency that is secured cryptographically, but also not issued or controlled or managed by a government or a supranational government organization like the European Central Bank or European Union. And that's really interesting. If you're, say, part of the diaspora that lives from your ancestral land and sends money home every single week or month, now you can do it using cryptocurrencies at a fraction of the cost. Or if you're someone living in Venezuela right now, where the country's going through, a slow motion collapse and the currency's being debased, it would be really helpful to have a store of value and a way to make payments that was not tethered to a collapsing government. But what's most interesting about Bitcoin is that it's based on this revolutionary technology called blockchain. And Bitcoin it's the first in use case, the first killer app, I think, for blockchain technology, but it's far from the last. And what's happened recently is that you've seen big enterprises and large incumbents, for that matter, looking at this technology as a way to not to democratize the world of financial services and bring about a better world, but to save a ton of money and maybe even make some money in the process. And I think that runs against some of the early ethos of the industry. But I see it differently. I see it all as R&D into this technology. If the 40 of the largest banks in the world want to get together to explore ways to make the financial services industry more efficient, I'm all for it. When IBM and others helped the Linux Foundation launch the Hyperledger project, which counts 25 major firms, including a half a dozen big banks, as its members, I was delighted. Linux is an open source project that's helped to create the biggest operating system in the world. Maybe they could, apply those resources to helping to reinvent or help to bring about this new Internet of Value. There's lots of discussion now between private blockchains and public blockchains. Private blockchains being the ones that are developed by consortia or by individual firms, versus public blockchains like Bitcoin and Ethereum, which are open and decentralized and accessible to anyone. Again, it's so early stages that I treat it all as just exciting developments overall in the space.
Mm-hmm. I presented on a panel with Vitalik Buterin in Luxembourg earlier this year, who, apart from being a phenomenally intelligent guy, stunningly brilliant, is doing intimidatingly brilliant. Absolutely, is. He's what he's doing with Ethereum is really potentially powerful. So if the Bitcoin blockchain is is kind of the the equivalent of computer language. He's building an OS effectively on top of it, a way for less technically savvy individuals to build new applications on top of a blockchain to potentially support some really interesting financial services and non-financial services solutions. How relevant do you see Ethereum being in the long term, kind of in the broader blockchain ecosystem?
Hugely relevant, of course, and I think it's a fascinating story what happened with Ethereum, and it's one I like to tell because Vitalik's a Canadian, and I'm very proud of what he's been able to accomplish. So Vitalik was a huge fan of Bitcoin. I mean, he was part of the Bitcoin community well before most people had really caught on to this. But what he saw in Bitcoin was a protocol that was purpose-built for moving money around the world, peer-to-peer. And he thought that a network based on blockchain could actually do more. It could move other types of assets, but it could also be a platform to program applications and to do what's called smart contracts. Now, a smart contract is a very simple idea, actually. It is a software program that mimics the logic of a contract with automatic enforcement and execution, and where payments are built into the contract so that money moves automatically when executed rather than having to rely on traditional intermediaries. And this would, as a technology, could become a whole new way of doing lots of different stuff. I won't get into that. But he launched this idea as a paper on GitHub and on Reddit. And basically it invited his friends and people he knew to participate in a crowd sale to help fund it. And in a matter of a month, he was able to raise the equivalent of $18 million in 2014, well before any big bank or any other major player had really caught on to blockchain. At the time, it was the largest crowd sale in history and remained so until another blockchain crowd sale this year actually smashed that record. So he took the funds and within a year had launched Ethereum, a global computer that was what he called Turing complete. So Turing complete means a computer that can do more than one function. A calculator is not Turing complete, it can calculate numbers. An iPhone is Turing complete, it can do lots of stuff. So Ethereum's like the iPhone of blockchain, basically. And within 6 months of launching it, it was worth $1 billion and was being widely implemented by a dozen or more Fortune 500 companies, including IBM, Microsoft, HPE, PwC, you name it. So I think that Ethereum is going to be an incredibly important part of the blockchain industry going forward. And if you If any of your listeners are based in Shanghai, the Ethereum DevCon, Developers Conference, is happening in Shanghai. The last one in London was held at a hotel. They were expecting a couple hundred people. There were 3,000 people at this event. Every seat was filled. There were people sitting on the floor lining the back of the room to watch these entrepreneurs who were building applications on blockchain. Every single one of these applications could completely transform an industry. So there was a company that was working on a new system for how we account for financial information using something called triple entry accounting, a debit, a credit, and a third entry on a blockchain that would be verifiable and auditable in real time. That could change the business of, say, Ernst & Young or PwC. A company that was building an alternative for the stock market, where tokens representing shares in companies can be traded peer-to-peer anywhere in the world between any two people without having to rely on exchange brokerages or any of the other traditional intermediaries. There were companies that were building remittance applications that would help to cut $60 billion of cost out of how individuals move money from the developed world to the developing world. There were applications to change the music industry, to change governance.
In terms of the future of blockchain to support value exchange, is it going to be Ethereum or Bitcoin? What are the distinguishing characteristics?
Ethereum is a platform on which developers can build all sorts of applications with rich functionality that Bitcoin, while it still could do that, was not necessarily programmed from the outset to be capable of handling. And you mentioned earlier that it should be easier to develop things on Ethereum, and that's true. To develop things on the Bitcoin platform requires you to have a knowledge of cryptography, which a lot of programmers don't. Whereas Ethereum enables you to build applications using more traditional programming languages like Java, C++, Python, etc. And that, as a result, just opens up the opportunity set of potential contributors in a way that could enable Ethereum to accelerate quite rapidly. Now, I don't want to overstate its significance today because it's still very early stages, but it's created a level of excitement and enthusiasm that's helped blockchain, I think, reach a much broader audience. All of a sudden, people in lots of different industries are talking about smart contracts. Smart contracts that self-execute for the trading and settlement of securities, smart contracts that explain rules for supply chain management, for the transfer of goods between parties. Smart contracts that enable individuals to sell power that they generate on their rooftop peer-to-peer to their neighbors without going through the traditional utilities system. All of those are going to each transform an industry in potentially profound ways. And importantly, they're not all related to financial services. So all of a sudden, companies are looking at this as a way of maybe even unbundling some of the capability of the firm. We use the work of an economist named Ronald Coase to help in our understanding of why we have companies. And he asked that question, why do we have companies? And he answered with one simple thing: transaction costs. So long as it's cheaper to do something inside the boundaries of the firm than outside of the firm, firms will continue to grow. So in the early days of the firm, Henry Ford had a rubber plantation, a timber mill, a steel plant, all inside the boundaries of Ford Motor Company because it was cheaper to be vertically integrated. Technologies helped to unbundle the firm somewhat, but there are still a lot of costs that have remained stubbornly high. The cost of establishing trust, the cost of contracting, the cost of enforcing and executing contracts haven't changed a great deal. Even though we've had this Internet of Information. Well, with blockchain, we think that those costs are going to decline materially. The cost of establishing trust. Well, now you've got a platform that enables trustless or less trusted transactions between any two parties. You've got a system through smart contracting that enables anybody to use basically software to develop contracting language that normally would have required lawyers and escrow agents and banks and courts and all these other relics of the industrial age. And you've got systems that self-execute and enforce automatically and make payments on their own. So there's opportunities for transformations, not just at the industry level, but at the underlying architecture of the firm.
Mm-hmm. So it sounds like there are almost four kind of macro categories of blockchain use cases or users even at this point, and it's no doubt oversimplifying, but there's kind of the peer-to-peer kind of crowdsourced consumer use, likes of Bitcoin and Ethereum, at least in its early days. There are some corporate use cases which may piggyback off the likes of an easy-to-operate platform like Ethereum. There are large kind of cross-industry use cases, some of the KYC, AML type projects that are being undertaken by financial services companies, for instance, the insurance sector, settlement and clearing, supply chain, finance, that require coordination across large, often multinational institutions. And then there are the public sector use cases, the likes of some of which you mentioned before. To what extent is there likely to be kind of cross-fertilization, crossover between those areas, or do consortia specific to financial services build their own technology from scratch, implement their own use cases which operate inside their own industries, public sector build their own technology from scratch, and similarly the systems and the use cases are relatively self-contained, or how much of that flows over, using your internet analogy, into one system which touches all parts of the public and private business and consumer ecosystem?
I'm going to rephrase your taxonomy, just simplify it into two categories, basically. One is closed proprietary systems, and the other is open source systems, essentially. Because a lot of the systems that were developed to manage transaction data and trade flow for, say, the financial services industry were developed not in the internet era, the PC era. They were actually developed in the mainframe era. And so that was a time when everything that was built was basically proprietary and was vendor-based. So you either built it yourself, or you were an IBM firm, or you were a whatever firm. These days, the most powerful computing tools in the world are actually open source, like the Linux operating system. So I think, like I said earlier, I think it's great that these big firms are working on these proprietary implementations. And I think that in some limited cases, they'll find lots of utility. But I think in general, open and distributed, and specifically open source, which means open to improvement and experimentation and development, it's likely to be the path that becomes the most successful. So right now, the blockchain world is fragmented. You've got Bitcoin, Ethereum, and these private blockchains. Whereas when you think about the internet, we have one internet. Well, the internet is actually a network of networks. So with blockchain, I think you'll see a similar, not consolidation, but connectivity, where all of these different systems have to talk to each other as part of a broader internet of value, where you might use the Bitcoin blockchain to settle a transaction in a financial asset, but where the contracting language might be built on Ethereum, and where the data about that transaction may be stored in some proprietary ledger that's shared by a consortium of banks. But that's all conjecture. I mean, it is very early to say how this is all going to interact. I was at a conference at a big technology firm where the head of blockchain was asked this question. And he said it's a great intellectual experiment, but it's too early really to talk about interoperability, because everything is still developing in its own silo, and it's very early stage. So for now, it's all happening in these different areas, but I think eventually you'll need some common standards, some common language, and some common technology to enable all these different systems to talk to each other.
Alex, thank you so much for the insight today. Where's the best place for people to find out more about you, connect with you, and learn more about your work?
Well, it was a great chat, Will. I really appreciate it. And as I said, this is the beginning of the blockchain revolution, so I encourage people to take steps to understand this. I'm very active in this community. I'm constantly writing about it. People can follow me on Twitter at Alex Tapscott, but also on LinkedIn, which is my primary publishing platform. So search me on LinkedIn, and you'll see updates from me fairly regularly. I'm also a contributor on Forbes.com, where I write about the impact of blockchain on business and government. Feel free to reach out to me in any of those different mediums. I'm always glad to engage in a discussion.
Great. Well, Alex, thanks for your time. Great to connect.
Thanks, Will. Appreciate it.
Thanks for tuning into Rebank. If you like today's show, reach out. Follow us on Twitter at Rebank Podcast and join the conversation. For more on banking, fintech, and the future, check out our regular content at www.bankingthefuture.com.